Hello, everyone. My name is Everly Eldeen. I am a sophomore in college, and I have been working with Johnson County Naturalists for a while. I got recommended to present what I did over the summer by Mark Bowman. So I made a little slideshow about my time in Ecuador. Can I go ahead and start screen sharing? So this summer, I spent 2 months at the center of the Earth. Actually crossed the equator maybe 12 times, which is kind of a weird, fun skill to have. But I ended up doing an internship and learning about banding tropical birds. So before all of this happened, I got involved with Johnson County Naturalists through this backpacking trip I did in Idaho in 2018. And I got to know Kristen Morrow really well, and she got to know me really well. And it's pretty hard for me to keep my love of birds quiet. So she picked up on that pretty quickly, mentioned me to Mark Bowman, and it all went uphill from there. Started learning how to bird band, met a bunch of you, which are all wonderful people, by the way. Had a wonderful time gaining some experience in high school and just learning the ropes exactly of how to bird band. So one of the main reasons I ended up getting this internship is because I had all of this previous experience. So thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to be able to do this. So Ecuador. Table of contents for the slideshow. So we'll go over where exactly I was in Ecuador. There are tons of different ecosystems that you can visit. The country itself is really small, so you could be at the coast within 3 hours, which is much different than the US. I'll talk a little bit about my supervisor, Dr. Butner. I'll talk about what I did exactly with the banding and data and insects, and then we'll talk about what's kind of happening as consequences of this research. So let's talk a little bit about where I was. I apologize for this photo. I trust me, I spent a lot of time trying to find a better one. If only I'd drawn it myself, but it shows where the reserve was. So we were on the side of the Andes in the Choco Darien ecosystem, which is one of the biggest kind of hotspots for biodiversity in the entire world. So if you're thinking about that, like just like thousands of species, hundreds that are endemic, it's just a super important ecoregion that stretches from Colombia to Ecuador all the way down to Peru. So it's the reserve that I stayed at is called Un Poco del Choco, which directly translates to a little bit of Choco. So it's kind of ironic, but yes, I stayed at this little tiny reserve, and it was a really incredible experience. So in addition to taking this internship, I kind of knew that I wanted to capture all of it, basically, so I could look back on it maybe when I'm your guys' age and look at all these beautiful pictures for the rest of time. So I asked my parents for a really nice camera. So in addition to doing intern stuff, I took a lot of pictures. So these are a couple of like the really iconic species that I saw, and I apologize that I couldn't put all of the species names on there. But it was absolutely incredible to see the variety just among the bird species, and everything else there, like the plants and the bugs and the reptiles were also incredible and just so alien to me being from the Midwest. It was just completely different. But there were a lot of birds. One of the really infamous birds from Un Poco del Choco is called the banded ground cuckoo, which I'm not sure if you guys have ever heard of before, but it's this really rare bird that can only be found in, it's like kind of like a legend almost, like only can be found in a couple of spots. And this reserve happens to be one of them. So all of these super famous birders have been there, and it was so cool to walk in their footsteps. And to kind of pretend that I was on my own little expedition. I did not end up seeing it, which I was really sad about. But it does offer just a little insight about how interesting the rainforest is. So the banded ground cuckoo is rare for a couple of reasons. You know, some of the main ones like habitat loss and climate change and, you know, human deforestation and all that fun stuff. But they're also kind of rare because they are very, very specialized. So I like to say the laws of nature are kind of reversed in the rainforest because the bugs, like millipedes, are bigger than birds. That's definitely not normal for the Midwest. It would be really weird to see that here, but it's just normal down there. And the ants are also very weird. So they're not like ants we have here in that they stay in one place consistently. They actually have this whole like monthly schedule where they build these bivouacs, which are essentially just ant hills made out of ants. Super weird. They stay in this spot for 14 days, gathering food, you know, reproducing. And then for the next 14 days, they set out onto the rainforest in literally like a pillage. So there's so many of these ants. They coat the rainforest floor with ants. And all of the bugs, if you were a spider on the ground and a bunch of ants came at you and they were very prepared, very organized, you would be in trouble. So you probably run away from the ants or you get eaten alive, which is unfortunately what happens. But what the bandy ground cuckoo does is it takes advantage of these escapees. So essentially what it does is follows these ants around and eats all of the bugs that they scare out of the ground. So they're very reliant on one species of army ant, which is, you know, rare in itself. And they're just super specialized with this mutualistic like parasitism on these army ants. So they're very hard to see. And in fact, my supervisor, Nicole, has been tracking them for a really long time. And she's actually recently given up because it's so much work to just follow the ants and then consequently to try to find these cuckoos, like literally climbing through the densest undergrowth to try to figure out where this bivouac is. And we ended up having one next to the station, which was really interesting to see. They would go out during the day, and then at night you'd have to carefully step over the little trails back, because if a soldier ant bit you, you'd have to go to the hospital to get it removed. Thankfully, that did not happen, but very cautious of the little warriors running around. So a little bit about my supervisor that I worked for. She is doing her PhD study on this question right here, which is how does the breeding season of tropical birds work? So Mark kind of gave me this awesome rundown before I went to Ecuador. And he kind of explained how reliant bird banding is on northern hemisphere seasons. So obviously the times of year are pretty dramatic from each other. You have winter, you have summer, the food is completely different, the water availability is completely different. All of these variables come together and they make kind of like spring generally the ideal time for birds to reproduce because it takes a ton of energy. But in the tropics, there's not really these dramatic seasons. But despite that, these birds are still somehow coordinating this breeding season, and we don't really know why. So that's what Nicole is doing. She's trying to figure out what exactly makes them tick into a reproductive status. And to do that, we collected all sorts of data, which I'll get into later. But we used the JD Wolf system, which I believe the Mark is switching to in addition. But essentially, the JD Wolf system allows us to age and sex tropical birds without relying on like winter or post-January or any of that stuff. It works for the Southern Hemisphere as well. And then, like I said earlier, just collecting data on what exactly we can understand. For example, like the breeding status of birds. If a bird has a brood patch or like a naked area on their chest, and we can say that they are sitting on eggs. Or if their cloaca is kind of elevated, we call it a cloacal protuberance. We can say that that bird's probably reproducing or trying to reproduce. So we can kind of get an idea of which birds are breeding right now and compare that to other data that we collect. So processing was a little different than the little passerines that I've been working with. So we had a whole variety of birds and sizes and weird obstacles to deal with. If you were to look at these three pictures and guess which one was the most dangerous, you probably would not say the hummingbird or this guy. You'd probably say the hawk. But actually, this bird, I think, made 3 people bleed. It was very vicious. So this bird is called a Andean cock on the rock. It's a female, so it's not super bright red like the males, but they have these vicious claws because they're very terrestrial. And they were, Nicole was a very experienced bander, shaking while holding this bird. And I was like, I was absorbing the anxiety. I was like, it's gonna get out, it's gonna get me. But of course, we had different processing methods. So a hummingbird that's the size of your finger is going to need different materials to band and measure and all of this fun stuff. So she actually had this like special little tube here for weighing, which they just look so funny to me with their little beaks sticking out, as opposed to the yogurt cups that we would use. But there was a lot of different stuff that went into collecting data, and I was a part of that. So just in this region alone, Nicole has seen 268 different species of birds, which I just think is insane. And in addition to staying on the reserve and collecting data, the other intern and I did a lot of traveling, and just if you took the entirety of Ecuador as a hotspot, there would be literally 3,000 species. It's just insane how many could be in this small 20-acre reserve. So it's really interesting to be surrounded by such dense biodiversity. So my role was a couple of different things as an intern. So these are pictures of the other intern, Jennifer, and please don't tell her that I use these. She'd probably be mad at me. But here you can see she's extracting a ornate flycatcher. This is Nicole, by the way. And so of course we did banding, we did extractions, we did measurements of biometrics, and we entered data on this computer here. She's got this master Excel spreadsheet. I don't even know how it still loads because there's so much data in it, that we put all of our information in. And then in the top left here, you can see this green-crowned brilliant taking a selfie. So one of the smaller projects that Nicole is working on is understanding how flowers are pollinated in this Choco-Darien ecosystem. And they've actually found a lot of really interesting information, especially with flowers that are really specialized. So maybe only one hummingbird can pollinate them, or one type of bug exactly. But this is a trail cam picture of this hummingbird, and there's a flower behind them somewhere. But what Jennifer and I would do is we would scroll through all of these pictures, which was a picture a second, because motion sensing is not fast enough to pick up hummingbirds. So we had tons of photos trying to figure out what exactly is pollinating these plants, and specifically what types of hummingbirds are doing that. So green crown brilliant, pretty cheeky little guy. I think I have a couple of pictures of them checking themselves out in the camera. But there was one species, the wedge-billed hummingbird, that was really interesting. So they are actually criminals. I'm not sure if you've heard of this before, but wedge-billed hummingbirds will pierce the flower where the nectar is and not transfer pollen at all. So what they do is they go up, they steal the nectar, and they leave, and the flower doesn't benefit. So it's really interesting to see how that relationship is affected by these wedge-billed hummingbirds. Quite rude, by the way. So they get this advantage because they don't have to adapt to the flower. They simply have this little short stabbing bill, and they just go right in and steal it. Obviously, for the flower, that is not a good situation. So here are 2 pictures of where I stayed for 2 months. This is my little room here, and this is the laboratory. And one of the projects we did too were bug surveys, which was not my favorite part. They smelled really bad and they were pretty gross, you can imagine. But essentially what we would do is take samples. The bugs would either fall into alcohol or fly into alcohol, and then we go back out in the rainforest and collect those samples of dead bugs, pour them out, and then look at them with these stereoscopes here to try to figure out what kind of family they were in, which was super hard. But that is just one of the many things that could possibly be a reason why birds are so seasonal in the tropics, despite not having really obvious reasons, is because of the presence of food. So we also looked at how many fruiting trees there were on this specific part of the trail, or how many flowers, right? Like just keeping track of food accessibility as a possible variable. So future implications, obviously the rainforest is decreasing in size every day. It's so sad to see, especially because these regions are super important for biodiversity and species. And so I heard a lot about the struggles that they've had with dealing with neighboring people who own land and the government and all of these different variables that come together to make reserving land really difficult. Should I slow this down or is this a good speed?
It's a good speed. Can you identify any of these birds for us?
Oh yeah. Well, let me stop it. I'm gonna challenge
Yeah,
here. All
yeah,
right.
I'd love to know what they are.
Okay, so this is one of the other really common hummingbirds. It's called a white-necked Jacobin, which is misleading, but there's a little bit of white right there. And this is a male. And at the beginning of my internship, I would just sit next to the hummingbird feeder for hours, just trying to figure out which one's which, and I was really bad. And then I eventually figured out that they're all Jacobins. They have a very weird plumage cycle where juveniles are born with the male plumage and then develop into female plumage, as opposed to most birds here who start with female plumage and then eventually molt into male plumage. So that was really weird. But yeah, they were very territorial and aggressive, and I got to learn all of their personalities per species, so that was really cool. This is that bird we saw earlier, the female cock on the rock, and you can see those vicious claws right there. But that's a very iconic bird for the Choco region, and they're very loud. I didn't hear any, but I listened to that audio later. This guy is a broad-billed motmot, and he's got a little tail feather coming in. And the motmots always hung out next to Nicole's house, which I thought was interesting. So I'd always go see what they're up to. This is a chestnut-capped brush finch, which is just so beautiful for any finch. Just over the top, very crisp, clean-looking bird. Um, just the colors are really interesting to me. Okay, this guy's funny. This is a puff bird. And it's called a puff bird for two reasons. Number one, they puff up, they look like little Muppets. They just get real mad and puffy. And then they also like stink on you like a skunk. So I didn't expect that. I didn't read about that. And then Nicole was like, oh my goodness, what does that smell? And it was because we had a puff bird in a bag. So they just kind of fart on you. Super weird, but very funny looking. This is the tiny hawk we saw earlier, and they're actually featured on the eBird website right now about what their diet is like. And what Nicole told me is that they eat these guys. So they're actually hummingbird hunters, which is really interesting. And this male, who is a goodness, I'll remember it later. He was actually fighting this tiny hawk, I think territorial, even though they eat them. So I'm not sure what his plan was. But it was cool to get them both in the same picture. He doesn't care at all, obviously. This is the turkey of the rainforest. It's called a guan. This one specifically is a wild guan. And they make the weirdest noises ever. So if you can imagine a turkey that's arboreal and just kind of like flopping around in the canopy, like they don't belong there, but they just kind of try to stay on branches and stuff. They make the sound of a chainsaw, which is kind of disorienting, especially when you're in the rainforest. So like sunrise, sunset, it's like, what is that? What is going on? Oh, it's just a guan. So super weird bird. This is a bronze wing parrot. They were really loud too. You could hear them flying over all the time. I actually took this picture on my birthday. It was the first time they stopped close enough that I could get a picture. But they were really cool, and I think parrots are just brilliant and such interesting species. So it was interesting to see what they were up to. And then after 2 months, I was planning on being there for 3. The other intern, Jennifer, asked me if I wanted to go to the Galapagos. And if you ever get asked if you wanted to go to the Galapagos, you need to say yes, because it was the best experience ever. And I definitely took a ton of pictures. So these guys here are blue-footed boobies. You can see why they get that name. And they were just the first of probably 1,000 birds that I saw. We were in these little dinghies here, just right next to the shore. They're so desensitized to humans. So we got to see their ritual. This is a Darwin's finch. I can't remember which one it is, but that was really cool to see as well. And I got to see multiple species. This is not a mom and chicks. This is actually two different species of cranes or egrets, excuse me. So you got cattle and you got the great. And there were thousands of these guys hanging out in this one mangrove tree. Apparently that they had flown from all of the islands to roost in this one particular area for the night. So that was really cool to see. And I'm sure you have seen this one a little far from Iowa, but great blue herons were there. It's always fun to see species that are also from home. Just very majestic in this region, and I understood why this heron was here. And then here we have American oyster catcher, yes. And they actually had really interesting eyes, like almost heart-shaped looking. And there were two of these and a juvenile hanging out, probing the sand for food. And then here's my favorite bird I saw. These were called swallow-tailed gulls. You were talking about gulls earlier. These ones were pretty iconic. They're just very smooth looking, in my opinion, like just like a little ombre there. It's almost like they're not real. And then I also got to see their full life cycle. So we have a little chick here. I got to see the juveniles and the eggs, which was really interesting. And the chicks were so cute. Little puffs, just adorable. You probably know this guy, the frigate bird. I did get to see some frigate birds do their thing, and it's not pretty. All that matters is the females like it, so I can't judge, but they were really interesting. And their nests are just really bad. Like if you thought pigeon nests were bad, these ones are worse. Like just like a pile of sticks, and this big bird with this huge wingspan because they just kind of soar around over sea all the time. Very interesting. And then here is another blue-footed booby, just a little more emotional. This is a baby frigate bird, and they also look like Muppets. In my opinion, they're just so funny. Here's another frigate. This is a female. The two different types of frigate birds are magnificent and great, and the only way you can tell them apart is because of their eye ring, which was really hard to do, especially when they're in flight. So I definitely put a lot of the eBird like species slash in there. Here's another really mad baby, very Muppet like. And then here's the swallowtail gull egg. So they actually nest straight on the rocks, which is pretty interesting, but you can see how well camouflaged that egg is. This is one of the other booby species that was there. These were called masked boobies in the past, but now they're called Nazca boobies. And they had these really crazy yellow eyes. And they had kind of drab feet, so no point in including those in the picture. But they were really interesting to see. And then this is the red-footed booby. The facial structures were so diverse as well. I just thought that was super interesting. This is the first time I got to see a short-eared owl, kind of an interesting place to do it. But they are the only diurnal owls in the world, and it is super hard to see them. This picture is nice because it's all focused, but if you were looking at this with your blind eye, it's super well camouflaged. There were petrel wings all over the ground, so we knew it had been here because it had been hunting. And it was really cool to see this bird fly around and try to hunt. And then here's another swallowtail gull baby. The juveniles look completely different from the adults in that they have this white plumage interlaced with this black feather work as well. Just super, kind of camouflage with the coral base here, but really pretty. And then this guy is a yellow-crowned night heron. I'm not sure if any of you have seen Despicable Me, but my friends say he looks like Gru. Just like very long and mad. So that guy was walking around. And then my last picture here is a white-cheeked pintail, which was, I think, one of two ducks I saw during the entire time. But in summary, it was a really cool experience, and I'm super glad I got to go. And thank you so much for listening.
Everly, thank you. So, what are your next plans?
So this summer, I actually have to go to boot camp for natural resource majors. So for 6 weeks, I'll be continuing school, which does not sound very fun. But after that, I think I will be working for Johnson County Naturalists. So you can see me around.
Oh, cool. That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Hey, Everly, in one of your early photos in Ecuador, there was a woman, and it might have been your supervisor there, who was wearing a jacket with a hood on,
Yeah,
with her hood up, and she was at her uh, computer. Does it get that cold down there? Or what?
So actually, that is a picture of her defending herself from the worst part of Ecuador, which are the mosquitoes. So you're talking about mosquitoes in Hawaii. They were thick as smog down there. You would cover yourself in rain gear to avoid being bitten because they were just so pervasive. And especially if it had rained the day before, then they would all hatch out and all be up in your jam. And if you're sitting at a computer for 4 hours, they're going to find you. So you put the hood up to try to protect yourself from them. I have a couple videos of her where I zoom in and you can just see them floating around like just everywhere. It's horrible.
Well, that brings up another question. When she was at the computer, how did you power the computers out there? Was there electricity?
Yeah, so initially when Nicole started this reserve, they were completely isolated from any civilization, and they used solar power to power most of the buildings and equipment. But recently they actually got power from the government, so they have supplemental power. So that's basically how everything was charged. You couldn't charge anything at night, you had to wait until the day.
There are different types of
What was your
Darwin.
favorite experience out of all of it? I was asking Everly, what did you feel like was the best thing you took away from it?
From the internship or from Ecuador?
From the internship.
I think the most important thing I learned is that tropical birds are a lot harder to study than I initially thought they were. So one of the biggest issues with Nicole's research is that there is no national database for banding data, and there's not really a path paved for people to do it. So for her, she has to outsource all of her material from Germany. She's submitting data to smaller projects which aren't really collaborating. There's no government involvement. So it's really difficult to get the infrastructure in the tropics to do banding.
Wow. Okay, Ben, you had a question.
You showed a picture of what you called a Darwin finch, but you sort of indicated that there were different types of Darwin finches. In other words,
yeah, so there are several species that are kind of like the iconic ones for his hypothesis. So on each different island, you would see a different species that he was talking about and comparing amongst themselves. Some of them had bills that were almost their complete head, like just super thick seed crushing bills. And then some of them had little, like more piercing bills. So it was really interesting to see the variety myself.
they just called them Darwin finches because those were the ones he used in his studies. And
they have less cool names. I like to refer to them as Darwin's finches.
Cool.
Are there any other questions or comments for Everly? Anybody? Well, my dear, thank you so very much. Thanks for sharing your experience with us. And we look forward to seeing you around over at Kent Park or other places where you are in the county. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It was my pleasure.